Here. So we're going to look at traits to have as we're in the series on Be the Message. And I just kind of want to set up the stage and then we'll talk it through. Paul, who is a famous guy in the New Testament, wrote roughly 2/3 of the New Testament books in the Bible, persecuted the church before he came to Christ. And so he had a lot of flaws, a lot of problems in his life, a lot of struggles in his life. And the religious leaders, the folks who were legalistic, maybe you might know some folks who are legalistic, they were critical of Paul. And what they tried to do is they tried to discredit Paul, because if they could discredit Paul and marginalize and minimize Paul's life, then they could go and they can say, hey, he's not the real deal. We could push him aside, and they could come in and then begin to kind of pull the legalistic stuff and begin to kind of lead, right? And so Paul was in kind of a tough spot, because he could kind of pull the, hey, I'm better than you pride card, right, and kind of push back that way, or he could go about it in a different way. The religious leaders got so desperate that they began to attack his appearance. We don't know much about him, but apparently he wasn't as handsome as some of the other people, so I have a hard time relating with Paul. And he wasn't a polished speaker. Apparently, he probably stood up quite a bit, and so they made fun of him for that, and they were trying to diminish him. They were trying to push him aside, kind of get rid of him, because they wanted to prove that he wasn't the real deal, and then they wanted to kind of step in. And as we kind of prepare through the series on Be the Message, and I think, how many times as believers do we think, God can use you, but I'm not so sure that he could use me, right? And I'll just be honest, and those of you who've been around here long, you know this. How can God use me? I mean, you're beautiful, you're wonderful, you guys smell nice, everything's wonderful in your life. God can use you, but how can he use a guy that's dyslexic? I mean, how could he use a guy that's dyslexic, that spends the majority of his time studying words? And then not only am I dyslexic, but I have like a funky thing that goes on in my brain that doesn't allow me to sound words out, because the sound in my brain and my tongue doesn't work together. So you can sound out words, I can't. Every word that I know is by memory. Every word. How can God use me? He can use you. Take it a step further. I don't like speaking in front of people. I'll be honest, I don't even like people. I'm not a people person. You guys think I'm kidding. If I had a choice between hanging out in my room or hanging out with a crowd of people, I'll stay in my room all day long. I know, that's why I can't relate to Paul. If you didn't hear, I'll put it on the tape. She said I was adorable. And it wasn't my wife. That's okay. Keep digging, Dan. You're almost out. Right? So God can use you, but how can he use me? And then we'll take it a step further. I came to Christ in 1988. And prior to my conversion, I didn't sing in a church choir. Okay? I was up to no good most of my time. If I was awake, I was scheming and plotting on something. I have skeletons, not literally. It's like, he's a murderer? But he's handsome, that's all that matters. But I have issues in my past, and every once in a while, friends from my past will come and remind me of my past, right? So God can use you, but how can he use me, right? And see, we believe that in our life. We believe that God can use someone else because, after all, look at you. You are wonderful, amazing, right, and all that stuff. But I'm up here, and I got my own problems and my own struggles and my own issues in my life. So how can God use me? And what Paul does that I think is absolutely brilliant is instead of pushing back and making himself filled with pride and say, look at, God's done this, that, and the other thing through me, he actually plays into their hand. And he embraces his weakness. He embraces his flaws. He embraces the struggles that he has in his life to point out that God's glory shines through broken vessels in life. And as we've been learning through the series, God takes our mess and he turns it into a message, doesn't he? He takes our uniqueness and our weakness and our limitations and our failures and our faults, and he uses it for his glory, right, in our life. And so when we begin to look at Paul's life, there's 5 traits that we have to really kind of analyze and ask ourselves, is that something that I have in my life? And if not, can I work get myself to that point where I begin to see it? Look with me if you have your outlines. You have an outline in your program there. Pull it out. You can follow along today. If you have your Bibles, 2 Corinthians is where we're ultimately going to go, chapter 6. But Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 9, he says, "For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church." And this was, prior, obviously we're going to read 2 Corinthians, but this is prior to that. And he points out, hey, I was one who persecuted the church. Before I came as a Christ follower, I was one that was causing problems for you. And he embraces his uniqueness, he embraces his problems in his life to kind of turn it back on people so that they will see God's glory shine in and through his life. And as we sit here today, I just kind of want you to realize all of us can be used by God. You have issues in your life? I do too. You have struggles in your life? I do too, right? Welcome to humanity. Welcome to a house filled with sinners, right? And God works in and through lives of broken people so that his glory will shine on the outside. So let's take a look. 5 traits that we need to embrace. Number 1, the first one and probably the most important one, is the area of humility. Humility. So fill in that blank there. And here it is. When I embrace my weakness and limitations, I become usable. And again, our world says push back from it, right? Don't reveal it, hide it, suppress it, don't talk about it. But in God's economy, God's like, no. You need to embrace your weakness. You need to embrace your limitations, your struggles, and your faults in your life. And you need to let God's light shine in and through that. So 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and we'll start in verse 6. "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts and gave us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ." Verse 7. Now what verse 7 is going to do is it's going to contrast verse 6. Verse 7 is about God's glory shining in and through our lives. And verse 7, the first word is but, and that is going to be a contrast. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from who? Us, right? So here's what Paul begins to do. As he kind of backdoors them, they're trying to criticize him, they're trying to marginalize him, they're kind of minimizing him, and instead of him pushing back and going, no, I'm somebody, all this other stuff, he plays into it, and then he gives them an illustration that's really quite amazing. He says the treasure, which is in your outline there, and that is the gospel. We've been learning that through, that the gospel is in us. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you carry the gospel message in you. And look with me in the gospel. The gospel message reveals the most profound truth the world has ever known, which produces the most powerful eternal effects. Through the gospel, we are freed from the power of sin. Any amens to that? And death. Any amens to that? And released from condemnation. Any amens to that? Transformed into the image of Christ. Right? God is shaping us and molding us and giving us eternal joy, peace, and satisfaction. That is in, as a believer in Jesus Christ, if you've invited Christ into your life, that is in you, Paul says. And then he does something pretty cool. He says that is carried in the jars of clay. The jars of clay in Paul's day, everyone would have them. Today, some of you guys like pottery, some of you don't. If Paul was speaking in today's context, you know what he would say? He would say, we are all like Tupperware bowls. Now, don't raise your hand, but how many of you have bowls made out of plastic that you bought something at the store that was in, and now you're reusing it, right? Huh? Yeah, don't raise your hand, right? And when you carry it to somewhere, it says, margarine on it or whatever it says, right? And you're reusing it, right? Now, the reality is, and we can have fun with it, the reality is that it's useless. There's no value. The value was what was in it. But you are a wise steward of God's money, and you feel that, hey, I can use it again, and so you're going to reuse it. So this is what Paul's saying. He's saying we're all like jars of clay. The jar of clay has no value. They're all over the place. Everyone has them. And what's interesting is the jars of clay, they would hide stuff in. So like where Jesus says your talents and you bury them, right? He's talking about jars of clay. The Dead Sea Scrolls, they were hidden in the caves in jars of clay, right? But they also used it for other things. They had no restrooms. They had no toilets. And so 2 a.m, right? Garbage in your house, they didn't have those little containers with bags in them. You just put whatever junk that you had in your house and stuff in the jars. And so as Paul begins to speak, remember, the legalistic people, they compared themselves to themselves. They looked in the mirror and said, I'm the best looking guy in the mirror. Well, yeah, because you're the only guy in the mirror. But that's how they lived. And so instead of Paul pushing back from a prideful position, he comes back around and he says, listen, let me just tell you, we're all worthless to a certain extent. We have no value. We're plain, we're common, jars of clay. But what's in us is the gospel. Because our value comes not for who we are, but whose we are and who is in us. See, if you wrestle with self-esteem, you're looking in the wrong place. You need to look at a man who hung on a cross for you. That's where you need to get your esteem from. You need to have Christ's esteem, that he was willing to crawl up on a cross and be nailed for your mess-ups. And Paul comes and he says, hey, all of us, we're just common, ordinary jars of clay. But in us is a treasure. In us has the power of break the bondage of sin, and I'm certainly an owner of that, of death, of condemnation, of peace, satisfaction. Paul says that's what's in you. And that's what makes you valuable. Otherwise, you're just a clay pot. And so as we kind of start and we think through the traits, the first one you've got to embrace is you've got to be humble. God gives grace to the humble, right? But he kicks the stool out of the proud, right out from under him. And you embrace your weakness. You embrace your faults. You embrace your failures. Because that's the message that God is going to use to speak in and through your life. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 5, Paul's talking about, hey, don't think that I'm like one of the super apostles. He goes on and he says, I am not a trained speaker. In verse 6, he says, but I do have knowledge. So I couldn't speak like all the others, but I do have knowledge. And the knowledge is the hidden in him is Christ. Right? And one of the famous verses where Paul is experiencing the thorn in the flesh in 2 Corinthians 11, or 12 rather, in verse 9 and following, he prays for the thorn in the flesh to be removed. And remember what God says to him? He says, no, I'm not going to remove it. My grace is sufficient for you. And look with me, look at how Paul does this. He says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your strength, in your perfection, in your good looks, in how smart you are, in your weakness, right? His strength is made perfect, or His power is made perfect in our weakness. And Paul goes, therefore I boast all more gladly about my good looks and charm, weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Now, when you read that, if you were to be honest with yourself, you'd probably say, I think Paul needs to go see someone. He needs to have a little conversation because his mind's a little bit torqued in the wrong direction. Well, why would a person walk around and kind of talk about his weaknesses and his uniquenesses and his flaws in his life? For that is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in my weakness, insults, in hardships, persecution, in difficulties. For when I am, what's the word? What's the word? Then I am strong. When I recognize that I'm just a common clay pot, nothing fancy, I got problems, I got cracks, we're all crackpots. Don't you feel at home? Your parents have been calling you a crackpot your whole life. Welcome to church. Now pastor's calling you a crackpot, right? We all have our flaws and our faults. And Paul says, you know what? Play with that. Run with it. Embrace it, because God's glory is going to shine through it when we have that humble attitude and we recognize that that's just who we are. Number 2, the second trait is invincibility. Invincibility. Look what it says there. He says, when I never give up despite pressures. Verse 8, Paul says, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. And let's just kind of go back and play through those, okay? Hard pressed, physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, it's all the pressures of life, right? Some are from the culture, some are from our families, some are in our own doings, so some is just living for Jesus. It's being pressed spiritually, physically, emotionally. We're being pressed in all different directions, he says, but we're not crushed. We feel the pressure, but we're not crushed. Perplexed is kind of a play on words. It means that you're at a loss, but not a total loss, all right? It's a Yogi Berra verse. It ain't over till it's over, right? I mean, that's a Yogi Berra type of thing, right? So we're perplexed, but we're not in despair. We're persecuted. That means hunted. It means chased after. It means that we're running for our life, because he was literally running for his life in many cases, but it says, but not abandoned. And what a principle to hold on, that God never leaves us nor forsakes us. What a way to live your life. That you are, as a believer in Jesus Christ, firmly placed in His hand. And there may be times where you're like, God, where are you? But the reality is, He has never moved, and you are still in His hand. Right? And so He says, hey, we're chased down, we're running for our life, but we're not abandoned. We're struck down, and that is a kind of a boxing term. That means, as you guys are into boxing, that means you get hit, boom! You get knocked down, but not knocked down. And you get a standing 8 count, right? The ref lets you come up and gives you a standing 8 count. And then he looks in your eyes and goes, you know what day it is? And you said, yeah, it's Thursday. Yeah, he said, welcome to Friday Night Fights. Get back in there and go for it, right? And off you go. It means that you're knocked down, but you're not destroyed. Now let's just kind of pause for a second. We're talking about being the message. See, oftentimes in our life, we feel a little headwind in our life, feel a little resistance in our life. Maybe the family criticizes, oh, you're a Jesus freak now? Oh, you want to go on a mission? Woo! Right? Oh, you're going to spend your money on what? How foolish is that? You feel a little bit of resistance. See, oftentimes what happens in our life, you know what we do? We stop. We surrender. We give up. And we're not really willing to press through and push through the wall that needs to be pushed through. And Paul says, hey, Here's a promise. Here's what Jesus said. Write it down. Ready? You're going to have troubles in this world. He said, I was persecuted. Write this down. Ready? So will you be. You're going to experience a headwind, whether it be from your enemy, whether it be from your family who now all of a sudden thinks you're a Jesus nut, your coworkers, right? Just society in general. And are you willing, is it going to be a trait in your life that even though you experience that headwind, that you're just going to keep on and you're not going to quit? You're going to move forward. Number 3 is selflessness. Selflessness. That's when I deny myself of my desires so that Jesus' light will shine through me. This is where, we pick up our cross, we deny ourselves. And this becomes, again, this is a difficult mindset to have because we live in a Burger King world. Have it your way, don't we? Is it true? I mean, that's what we're told. And yet when it comes to being a Christ follower, we're to die to self. And Paul says this, when it comes to a Burger King way or a Jesus way, I pick the Jesus way every single time. I don't want to have it my way. Because if I have it my way, His light isn't going to shine through me. I'm going to deny myself, and I'm going to allow His life and His light to shine through my life. Verse 10. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. Verse 11. For we who are alive are always being given over to death. For what reason? For Jesus' sake. Well, why would we do that? So that His life may be revealed in our mortal, common jars of clay. When we deny ourselves and we don't live the Burger King way and we live the Jesus way, then His light and His life is going to shine in and through us. In Galatians, Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. In other words, as a believer in Jesus Christ, the moment that you said, I'm going to invite Jesus into my life, you no longer owned your life. Jesus owned it. He paid a price, and His price was His life. And that when we surrender our life to Him, He doesn't take away the joy. Man, He fills our life with great joy. Right? So oftentimes we think, oh man, if I surrender, that means I'm not going to have. Oh, no. You've completely missed it. You won't have what the world has. Right? And boy, doesn't that work good. But you will have what Christ desires to give you, which is incredible in your life. And so when we think about that, are we willing to live a selfless life, and are we willing to surrender to Him? The fourth trait is faithfulness. Faithfulness. And I'm just going to encourage you guys to put a little asterisk on the side because we're going to carry this on for a minute. And here's what it is. When I have convictions that start in my head and go into my heart and are revealed through my hands. Now that is a picture of what we talk about when we talk about spiritual growth in our church. Spiritual growth is one of the core values, and we say that spiritual growth is not head knowledge, it's having knowledge in our head that translates into convictions in our heart that ultimately reveal themselves in our hands, right? That is spiritual growth. It's head knowledge, right? Facts and figures and so forth, that's translated into convictions in our life and ultimately reveal itself in actions or in our hands in our life. And so we believe lots of things. Would you agree with that? Your beliefs, you hold many beliefs. So let's just play along with me and we'll have some fun. We believe that we are to eat our vegetables on a regular basis, right? We believe that we should brush our teeth and floss, brush our teeth 3 times a day, floss at least twice a day. We believe that. Some of you are not so much, right? Some of you are like, hey, once a week, it's good. It's all, right? We believe that we ought to exercise for an hour a day. Okay, not so much. We believe that we shouldn't eat donuts. All right, I won't meddle now anymore. We'll get back. Ice cream is a sanctified fruit of the heavens. In fact, I was just telling a couple earlier today that it is its own food pyramid. Ice cream is. It is. It's of course it's my definition, but that's Dan's way. There's lots of things that we believe, right? So we believe this. We believe that we need to, if you're married, we believe that family needs to be a priority. We believe that. Now let's stop. Let's think about this. There are lots of things that we believe, but it's not convictions in our heart, is it? See, we say, my kids are my priority. But does it translate onto a calendar? See, we believe that, but it's not a conviction in our heart. Therefore, we're not doing it in our hands. We believe that we ought to read through the Scriptures, but if it's not a conviction in our heart, it doesn't translate into our hands where we actually do it. We believe we ought to pray. We believe prayer can move mountains. We believe prayer can heal our friends and family who are ill and so forth. But if it's not a conviction, we're not doing it. And therefore, it's not revealing itself in its hands, in the actions. Right? We believe that we ought to live within our budget. But if it's not a conviction, then as long as they're sending credit cards, because it's not a conviction. Right? And so this principle, it's a spiritual principle, but it really covers in every area of our life. You can take this principle, head, heart, and hands, into your corporation. Lots of corporations say, we believe it's a core value. Look, it's on the wall. But you know it isn't in staff meetings and meetings. It's just simply a belief, right, in our life. And so the danger is that it stays here. And that's all. It just stays there. See, faithfulness, we've been taught, hey, it's all about head knowledge, Bible study, memorization, Bible study, memorization. No, it's application. Application is what transforms your life, right? It's the memorization, the Bible study, and so forth that comes into the heart that ultimately changes your life. Knowing facts and figures is not enough, right? So let's take a look at this verse 13. So Paul says this, it is written, and I'm going to have you write some things underneath these words. Ready? I believe, and then right under the word believe, write the word head, H-E-A-D. So Paul says, I believe, head knowledge. Therefore, circle the word therefore, and right underneath that, conviction. Because in between his belief and him speaking, there is a conviction that he is compelled to do something. Right? I believe, therefore I have spoken. And you can write under those three words under I have spoken is hands. So you have believe, head, therefore heart or convictions, and I have spoken, hands or actions. So he is faithful, not just believing, but actually doing it, compelled to do something. And it goes on and says, with the same spirit of faith, we also believe and therefore speak. Action. Right? So when it comes to faithfulness in your life, it's not enough just to believe. Is it a conviction in your heart where it actually translates into actions in your hands? Right? And I mean, from a pastor's standpoint, there's nothing more thrilling from a pastor's standpoint is where people get this and begin to apply it and understand it in their life. Because, oftentimes people think, well, the pastor just wants to get stuff. No, I want to see you. I want to see you blessed, right? I want to see God using you and working in and through your life where you are receiving, not from me, from Him. I'm just a clay pot, right? From Him. And to translate from just the belief aspect to actually doing it in our life. We have a guy, just to share a story from yesterday. He moved out of the area. He lives somewhere down in Hayward area. And every Saturday, nearly every Saturday, he'll either come and meet me here, because I come down here in the mornings, or he'll leave me a little packet. He believes in tithing. And he hasn't found a church in where he's at, and so he feels he's convicted that that's what God wants him to do, and that's a conviction he has in his life. And so he'll drive all the way, because he doesn't do with checks, and I told him, hey, just do checks. No, I work in cash only, man. I've been down the credit card thing. I'm bankrupt. I do cash only. That's the only way I operate. Cash only, right? That is a conviction that he has in his life. And so he comes every Saturday, and he'll give me an envelope or leave me an envelope in the mail slot for it. And so yesterday I was here, and he says to me, hey, I haven't found a church yet. I'm still looking. I'm praying for you. God has a place for you. He says, but I just want you to know, I don't give just on my net. I give on my gross, because listen, Pastor, I want you to know one thing. God has never let me down. Now, I don't say that to get anything. Financially, we're fine. My challenge to you is that you may take that next step so that you will receive from Him. And that's a step for us. We believe, but is it a core value? Is it a conviction in our heart to actually do? And this guy drives an hour because it is a conviction he has in his life, right? And you can take this principle in every area, whether it be spiritual, your work, your family life, and you can ask yourself, I believe it, but is it a conviction? Folks, if it isn't a conviction, FYI, it's worthless, right? Because you're not doing it. And knowing that I should eat my fruits and vegetables does me no good. Doing it does me good. We with me? Number 5 is hopefulness. And that is when we are confident that there is something more than this life. Aren't we glad that everything isn't put into this world and this is the end of it and that's all? It's like whatever's here is all it gets. Doesn't get any better than that. Man, I am so grateful that that isn't the case. Paul goes on and he says in verse 14, because we know that the one who raised Jesus from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with Him in His presence. So here's what Paul says. At the end of the day, I'm a clay pot. That's all I am. And even if my enemies press against me, and even if ultimately I get killed for the cause of the gospel, Jesus, who was raised from the dead on Easter, that power will raise me, Paul, a common pot, worthless, will raise me from the dead, and my life isn't about what's here. Ultimately, my life is about what's in heaven. And that I am simply just a passing by this place called planet Earth. Now, you think about that for a moment. You think about how much energy, stress, right? So much of our life is focusing in on things of this earth. To me, I think it would be freeing to know it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. The stuff that you drive yourself crazy and in some cases probably nearly kill yourself to have, is passing. And Paul says, it's not going to matter, because at the end of the day, I'm going to be raised to life, and I'll be in the presence of the Lord forever. Why? Here's why, verse 15. Powerful verse, and then we're going to go. All of this is for my sake. No, what's it say? Some of you are like, I know the guy's dyslexic, but where does he get that at? All this is for your benefit. Now think about what he's saying here. He's saying all this. The humility, the idea that I'm going to just keep on going, the selflessness, the faithfulness, the hopefulness that I have. All of this that's shining through a common pot of no value, all of this is for your benefit, not mine. Now hit the pause button. When you are not the message, and you are not using your uniqueness, and you're not using the message that you have in your life for God's glory, and you're not using your spiritual gifts and your talents and so forth, do you know who's harmed? We are. We are. All of that is not for you. It's for us, the body. Right? And so when we sit on our abilities and we don't use them for His kingdom, we all get cheated. We all get cheated. But I can't be used by God. No, that's Paul's point. You're a broken vessel. Of course you could be used by Him. I mean, that's like a duh question. He says, so all this is for your benefit, so that the grace that is reaching, what's the word? And who? People. Right? So it's for your benefit, that you're encouraged, that you're built up, that you're strengthened, so that the grace that's in you, right, the gospel that's in you, is going to be carried to more and more people. So we come on Sunday to be encouraged, to be challenged, to be convicted, to be, helped sort out our spiritual gifts and our abilities and so forth, to leave, to reach more and more people with His grace that we have experienced in our own life, right? Whether that be going on a mission or, as Eric said, going next door. And as a result of reaching more and more people, that the people may cause thanksgiving, that is worship, that is singing praises, not necessarily, in songs per se, but that is an attitude of thanksgiving with an attitude of, isn't God great? Isn't God amazing? Right? And as we go and we share the grace that we have experienced, lives are touched, lives are encouraged. We come back with stories. We come back with, you won't believe what God has done. And what ends up happening, it overflows. And ultimately, who gets the glory according to this verse? The overflow, right? The thanksgiving to overflow to the glory of God. Now, if I were to ask you when you guys came in, hey, how many of you want to glorify God today? Everyone would say, I'm here, that's what I'm here for, man. Well, here it is. Recognize your uniqueness. You're a clay pot. You're a Tupperware dish. You're a bowl of margarine that someone's going to reuse. Your lid isn't even going to fit tight. When you put soup in the back of the car and you drive down the road, it's going to spill over into the floorboard of your car. Has anybody been there before? Yeah, my wife's like, now don't hit the brakes too hard, it'll spill. I'm like, well, can't we use one of those good ones? It's like, well, we can't bring the good ones over there because we may not get it back. It's like, so what? Here comes oh no, there's a kid in a bicycle. Poof! Oh, I didn't hit the brakes too hard. I didn't spill anything. I mean, he's on the side of the road, but everything's okay. You okay, honey? I'm okay. Come on, y'all been there, right? Aren't you glad your lid doesn't fit tight? Here's my encouragement, folks. Here's my encouragement. Don't ever let a thought come into your mind that says God can't use you. Don't ever let that. In you, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, is the greatest message that this world has ever heard. It's the greatest message. It will break the bondage of sin, of death, of condemnation. It will give you peace. It will give you purpose. It will give you just the attitude that regardless of what takes place in your life, you are in the hand of the Almighty God. That message is in you. And don't let the legalistic people, don't let your former friends, don't let your coworkers, don't let your spouse, don't let anybody tell you that God can't use you. He can. And if we are to go out and be the message, embrace your uniqueness, folks. Embrace it. Because your greatest message will come out of your messed up stories that you have in life.